Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining me today. So, this is my story. My story started back in 2020 during lockdown because of COVID 19. At the time, I had to teach English 3, and the book that I was supposed to use contained gender stereotypes towards women. So I slightly made modifications to my materials. In 2021, I made more modifications to my syllabus. And at the end of that semester, I surveyed my students. Their positive responses made me wonder how they will react if I change all my material so we could talk about women during the whole semester. In 2022, I decided to do exactly that. I changed my whole syllabus so we could talk about women, their achievements, their role in history, and the stereotypes that they normally face every single day. At the end of that semester, I once again surveyed my students, and the responses were amazing, and I knew that I was in the correct track. In 2023, I decided to take a break, and I only modified the materials that I had created the previous year. Last year, in 2024, I was informed that I was going to be working with the same group I had back in 2022. At the time, taught them English 3, but now I was going to teach them English 6. So to me, this was the perfect opportunity to continue what I had started. In our country, Mexico, there has been a long standing convention of clearly defining gender inequalities, which have resulted in male dominance and female subordination. These gender inequalities are very visible in different areas such as politics, healthcare, economics, and even education. For Sanchez Aguilar, these gender inequalities and gender stereotypes can be ingrained in everything that we bring into the classroom. For Sunderland, gender representation in EFL course books can affect language learners and language users in three different ways. First, there is an unconscious um, influence of restricted social, behavioral, and linguistic female roles. Second, these or female students can become demotivated if they notice these restricted portrayals. And third, there is a promotion of models of language that can become classroom practice, such as male firstness in conversations. Therefore, it's necessary to produce and maintain gender balanced course books for everyone. There is evidence that there is an unfair representation of women in EFL course books in which women are given stereotype roles. They do not appear as frequent as men, or their presence is clearly suppressed. For Sanchez Aguilar, gender and language studies in our country, Mexico, on EFL course books is very limited. For Siborn, for language learning to be effective, learners need to see themselves reflected in the materials. When the materials are relevant to their lives, learners they feel included and engaged. Otherwise, they feel excluded and they may perceive that the materials are irrelevant. If they perceive that the materials are irrelevant, they may struggle to connect with them. Hence, it's imperative to provide learning materials that supports their needs, and this means considering inclusion. Rios et al. State that the curriculum can facilitate change in students' beliefs about social identity in general and about gender in particular. According to these authors, including successful women as role models in areas where students might not expect to see them, might help them question their existing beliefs about what women can and cannot achieve. According to Schmeichel, the main objective of bringing attention to women in the curriculum is not just to drag the topic of gender in, but rather using their voices to create a more complete picture by considering women's stories, we can gain a deeper understanding of not just the past, but also how gender has an impact on social structures and current events. So, by modifying my syllabus once again, I wanted to give visibility to women in different areas. I also wanted to raise awareness on the experiences women encounter on a daily basis. And I wanted my students to reflect on some of the gender roles and gender stereotypes women face. So I decided to carry out pedagogical action research. According to Norton, the purpose of pedagogical action research is to systematically investigate one's own teaching practice with the aim of improving such practice and contributing to theoretical knowledge to benefit our students' learning. So Norton came up with an acronym for the different stages of pedagogical action research. Eat them. So, stage number one is identifying a problem. Stage number two is thinking of ways to tackle the problem. Stage number three is doing some changes. Stage number four is evaluating those changes. And stage number five is modifying our future practice. For me, stage number one was already sorted out. So let's move to step number two, thinking of ways to tackle the problem. So, what follows was a revision of my syllabus. I already had in mind some themes and topics that align perfectly with the grammatical contents and vocabulary my students needed to study during the course. So here you have the final outline of that analysis. So at the beginning, my students needed to do a review of passive voice in the present, in the past, in the future, and they needed to learn about impersonal passive. So we studied those contents by discussing about unpaid care work, breaking the glass ceiling, and we even discussed about the first female Mexican president. My students also needed to learn different phrases to express their opinions, backing them up, asking for opinions. Also, they needed to learn some other expressions to agree, disagree, partly agree, to suggest, to ask for, grant, and even refuse permission. For those contents, we talk about how women are represented in sports. We talk about women's studies, how women are represented in course books, and how women's ideas have been credited to men. In my course, my students needed to study different conditional sentences. So for those, we talk about timeline pressures for women. We discuss about the definition of hip eating, and we also talk about a movement, a Mexican movement led by women, which was called A Day Without Us. We did a review as well of the past simple and past continuous, past perfect and past perfect continuous, as well as would and used to, future and future in the past. For those contents, we talk about how women are represented in fairy tales, movies, and art in general. We also needed to study indefinite pronouns, and for that, we discuss about the dream gap. My students needed to know the difference between gerunds and participles, and we did that by studying the role of women during the Mexican Revolution. And last but not least, we learned about adverbs and adverbial phrases, and we discussed how women have been represented in history overall. Now, having that outline, I needed to apply all of that. Okay. So in my university, we have every semester 16 teaching weeks. So here are the weeks in which I applied changes to my materials. Week 1, 3, 5, 6, 8, 9, 11, and 12. It is worth mentioning that the materials and the activities created for students consider the different skills of the language: speaking, reading, listening, writing, and even grammar and vocabulary. Additionally, those activities and materials were created considering the certificate in advanced English because my students needed to become familiar with the format of the exam and the different exercises that it contains. So I'm going to show you some of the images and activities that I brought into the classroom to discuss. So here's one of them. Here's a picture of Las Diablillas from Hudson Up. They are a group of Mayan women who play softball and who have become very popular in our state. Have you ever heard about the 7 ages of man? Well, in class we discuss about the 7 ages of woman. Here's a speaking activity. So I provided my students with some statements regarding how women are depicted in fairy tales, and they needed to discuss with a friend if they agreed or disagreed with them. Here's a writing exercise in which I ask my students to answer to this question using the structure that we cover in class. Conditional 2. How would you react if someone hit pitied you? What things will you say and do? Here's a clear example of one of the exercises that I modified from the certificate in advanced English, in which students have to discuss a spider web and then reach to a decision. Here's also a picture that I use for the warm-up stage in a lesson in which I was going to teach indefinite pronouns. So we discussed what Barbie's motto was. And last but not least, here's an exercise of listening. So for this one, my students needed to listen to a professor giving a short presentation on the role of the soldaderas during the Mexican Revolution, and they needed to answer some multiple choice questions. And there are much more examples, but here are some of them. So let's move on to step number 4. So I applied all of those materials. So now it was time to evaluate the changes, how they were perceived by my students. So once more, I survey my students at the end of the semester, and I'm going to show you the results of such analysis. So regarding my students' perceptions regarding the materials that we use in our course, they explained that talking about women was interesting for them because talking about them in the curriculum is overlooked. They also mentioned that they become more aware of women's experiences in the real world, and they were able to reflect on situations and gender stereotypes they completely disregarded. Additionally, they explained that talking about women in class fostered a stimulating learning environment because there was a lot to discuss about, and the classroom discussions were insightful. Last but not least, they were aware that English and content about women were learned simultaneously. Regarding my students' motivation, they claimed that their motivation increased as a result of the materials used. They stated that the topics were more diverse than those covered in a regular English class, and the materials discussed in class were thought provoking. Hence, this increased their interest in the contents and also their attention. They also said that the materials used resonated with their own experiences because they have experienced, seen, or heard about them before. They also explained that the materials helped them to learn English structures better because they were able to identify how the structures were used in real contents, and they felt comfortable with their classmates and the professor. They acknowledged that their opinions were listened to and always respected. When I asked them about the significance of the materials, they said that they become more aware. They realize that these are situations that are not exclusive to our country. They notice the reality of these different situations women experience, but this is not talked about as much in the curriculum. They comprehended that doing this was a way of inclusion, and they perceive that women's accomplishments are frequently undervalued. My students also provided some recommendations. They said that if teachers or professors were to do this in their classrooms, meaning modifying their materials, they said that they need to consider women's achievements in history and society and the problems that they have struggled for years. At the end, I asked them what were the lessons that they learned in my course. And they claimed that they learned new concepts, women's accomplishments through our history, social problems, and that they learned to be more aware and to reflect on those problems. Now, I have to be honest, in that semester, I only had 2 10 students. 6 of them were male and 4 of them were female. So you may be wondering how everything turned out. Well, my male students were always had an open mind and they were always willing to participate. So they brought their own experiences to class and they compared those to women's experiences. So classes turned more fruitful and more complete. So now I'm going to show you some of the comments that my students provided in the survey. These are in Spanish because, and I left them like that because I wanted you to read their own words. A veces es monótono ver las cosas, los mismos temas y el mismo vocabulario. Se vuelve muy aburrido. Meter estos temas acerca de la mujer es ampliar el conocimiento de los alumnos. Al tocar los temas, mis compañeros de clase y yo comentábamos mucho al respecto y la clase se volvía más dinámica. Eso me hacía sentir motivada e interesada. Los contenidos están relacionados a la vida real, a situaciones que pasan y que puedes ocupar cuando te encuentras en una situación así. Pienso que fueron bastante claras las situaciones que se presentaban, dando un contexto y dejándonos pensar qué podríamos hacer para cambiarlo. Pienso que hay cosas que antes no me daba cuenta que estaban sucediendo y lo tenía normalizado. Y al tocar estos temas ahora veo las cosas con otra perspectiva. A través de las historias y los conceptos que nos fueron explicados, pude vislumbrar un poco sobre la situación antes y actualmente sobre la mujer. Me sentí en un ambiente seguro con mis compañeros y con la maestra. Sentí que mis pensamientos fueron escuchados por primera vez. Me llevo una experiencia única y divertida de la cual pude aprender muchos temas diferentes y también me ayudaron a practicar mi inglés para dar mi opinión acerca de estos temas tan interesantes. So you have heard them. So let's move on to step number 5, modifying future practice. So what's next? So far, I have already modified 2 syllabi from my university, and I have convinced some other teachers to use my materials. In the future, I'm going to keep carrying out pedagogical action research because, in the words of Norton, by making small-scale interventions, you can often bring about significant pedagogical changes. In my case, by modifying my materials to give more representation to women, classes turned into more complete, into more enriching ones, and students were more engaged. So to me, this is worth trying. So far in this presentation, we have discussed about how gender stereotypes can be embedded in everything that we bring into the classroom. And we need to be aware that in some way, these materials can have an impact in our students' perceptions and beliefs. Be mindful that you can consciously modify your materials. So for my fellow English teachers, I'm going to end this presentation with this question. So please reflect on it. How are women portrayed in the materials that you use? Hopefully, they are portrayed as capable, diverse, and as influential members of our society. So thank you very much for listening. I deeply appreciate it.